Dr. Moises F. Salinas is Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Central Connecticut State University. The author of The Politics of Stereotype in 2003, Salinas spent part of 2005 and 2006 in the Middle East to conduct interviews and research for this book. His undergraduate degree is from Hebrew University, and his PhD in educational psychology is from the University of Texas at Austin. Today, Dr. Salinas will speak on his book, Planting Hatred, Sowing Pain, The Psychology of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to start today by telling you a little bit about what motivated me to do this research. I've been involved in issues that have to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for a long time. But in the past few years, I've been looking at a number of studies that show that anywhere between 60 and 70% of the people on both sides of the conflict support the basic parameters of a peace agreement along the lines of what was the Clinton proposal, the Geneva Initiative, the Arab Initiative. That means two states around the 1967 borders with some sort of compensation for the refugees, some sort of agreement for Jerusalem. And as a psychologist, the question I had was very simple. How come it's anywhere from 60 to 70% support this, we just don't do it? And the answer can be found in some of the same surveys. For instance, surveys by the Statement Center, the Truman Center, the Palestinian Center for Survey Research, show that even though there is support for a peace agreement, there is also a lot of distrust. On one question, for instance, people were asked, would you support a peace agreement under these parameters? And again, on both sides, over 60% would say yes. But when they were asked, do you think the other side would support it? Anywhere between 75 to 85% said no, the other side would not. In order to do this study, I moved to Israel for a year. We conducted about 255 interviews of Israelis and Palestinians. And some of the interviews show exactly this phenomenon. Some examples. Hassan, a Palestinian from the outskirts of Jerusalem, said, I don't hate Israelis. All I want, Allah willing, is to have a good life for me and my children. The problem is, the Israelis are the obstacle. They are determined to make our life miserable until we live or we die. I don't want to give them that satisfaction. Yossi, an Israeli from Tel Aviv, said, of course I want peace. All we want is peace. It is the Palestinians who are the fanatics. They won't rest until they throw us into the sea. I reviewed the literature on this question, and I found that there were mainly four areas in which there has been research regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in psychological area. Stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination was the first one. Extremism, terrorism, fundamentalism was the second one. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and other psychological consequences, the third. And the last one, reconciliation and conflict resolution. So I divided the book in those four chapters, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those four areas. First, stereotypes. It is important to say that there are stereotypes in both cultures. Stereotypes are a normal phenomenon that exists in pretty much every single society in the world. And there are stereotypes of Palestinians among Israelis and stereotypes of Israelis and Jews among Palestinians. In Israel, for example, what we see is something that is called aversive racism, or contemporary form of prejudice, in which there are a lot of underlying prejudices and stereotypes when you look, but openly people don't talk much about it. This is very similar to what happens about minorities here in the United States. However, for instance, a 1998 study showed that every time Arabs were portrayed in Israeli television or cinema, they were usually portrayed in negative roles like criminals or terrorists. A study by Daniel Bartal from Tel Aviv University looked at books and educational materials and showed that by and large Palestinians were stereotyped as violent, backwards, and uneducated. The situation among the Palestinian side is worse because the use of overt stereotypes is a lot more accepted. Jews are not only stereotyped, they are commonly vilified in the media, and many of the classical stereotypes like the Shylock, the blood libel, mentions of the protocols of the elders of Zion, Holocaust denial, all of these things are commonplace. The prevalence of stereotypes and prejudice is a problem because research shows that when you stereotype your opponent, you're not even willing to listen to what they have to say. Whatever they have to say, you will distort it to fit your own stereotypical preconceptions of the other group, and that doesn't allow for any kind of negotiation of communication. Much more importantly, the acceptance of stereotype fuels hatred and extremism. A couple of excerpts from the interviews. For instance, Anna, a young woman from Israel, she was asked, what do you think, what will happen now that Hamas, the radical Islamic movement, was elected, this was after the elections in which Hamas took control of the Palestinian Authority, and she said, we have to wait and see. They, the Palestinians, are terrorists. It is their nature. Their nature is to kill. Soha, a Palestinian woman whose son was very sick, and she got special permission to go to a hospital in Afula in northern Israel to treat the son. She said the following: since the time I have been running from one hospital to another hospital, and I have had to meet Jews, and I have seen their behavior towards me and my children, and I can see the hatred and anger in their eyes, I understood that there is no chance for peace, and there will never be. Our only alternative is to fight them and to return them to Europe or the USA, but not in our land. Stereotypes are the basis for extremism and fanatism. So the next chapter of the book deals with extremism. The first thing that I found out when I started looking at the literature is that there is no personality profile for who an extremist is. We used to believe many years ago that extremists, terrorists, had to fit certain personality profile, but that is actually not true. Extremists come from every single personality type, every single social strata, every single level of education. There are some social characteristics that correlate with a higher probability of extremism emerging in a society. First, if there is a generalized perception of hatred and injustice. If you feel that you live in a society in which unfair things are happening, that increases the probability that there will be extremism. Also, the social acceptance and tolerance of violence as a means to solve conflicts is something that correlates with emergence of extremist groups in a society. First, in Israel, the large majority of the Israeli society does not condone violence as a way to solving problems and does not like when violent actions are taken. But there is a minority of about 20% of Israelis, the right-wing extremists, usually those who are settlers in the occupied territories, who actually fit the profile perfectly. And that can be seen, for instance, in a number of attitudes that they have towards people who have committed acts of violence. Some examples: Yigal Amir, the person who actually assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, he is idolized among right-wing settlers as a national hero. And there are a number of websites that if you go and you take a look at them, you can see that they see him as somebody who actually was willing to sacrifice for the good of the nation. Baruch Goldstein was a right-wing settler who went into the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron when the Muslims were praying there and started shooting, and according to different accounts, killed something between 30-something and 50 people. There are monuments on his honor in many of these settlements. And there are websites in which they glorify him as a martyr for the cause because he was killed. Eventually the Palestinians were able to get a hold of him and they killed him. So he is seen as a martyr for the cause. Among the Palestinians, the prevalence of violence is greater, but also the sense of despair is, of course, greater. One of the things that I found that was really interesting is that many of these radical organizations that recruit people to become suicide bombers, they don't send their own people to these operations. That was very, very interesting. They actually recruit people from the outside, and they usually look at people who are vulnerable in one way or another. For example, in some cases they get to families that have been dishonored for some reason, or that are having serious economic problems, they approach them and they say, do you want to regain your honor? Do you want to get some financial incentive? All you have to do is sign a petition that you will be willing someday. You don't have to do anything. You just have to sign for now. That someday you might be willing to sacrifice yourself for Palestine. And I will give you $5,000, and you will also become you will regain some of your honor for doing that. So it sounds like an easy proposition. Of course, I'll sign, no problem. Several months later, they might come and say, well, remember that you signed? Well, now we don't want you to do anything. We just want you to make a video. And we will market the video. So you will become like a hero, and that will give you a lot of honor, and we will also give you a little bit more money. I said, well, sure, no problem. So I'll make the video. And several months later, they come and they say, well, now it's time when you have to do the operation. And if you back out, remember you made a video and said, look, this guy, he's a coward. He made a video, he was willing to do it, but he backed out because he's a coward now. And you have to return the money that we gave you. These are many of the social psychological tactics that people here use to sell you used cars, for instance. But they use many of these tactics to recruit people who are vulnerable and in order to become suicide bombers. Couple of excerpts from the interviews. This is Hussein, a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, said, I support any organization that calls for the destruction of the State of Israel, because this is Palestinian land and it will remain Palestinian. The Jews came as parasites and controlled all the land, just so the Americans and the British could get rid of them. I see the Palestinian actions, the attacks against the State of Israel, as heroic actions resulting from a natural reaction to the occupation. I am sure that all the Jews are murderers, just because they conquered my land. I hate every Jew. Itamar, a settler in the occupied territory, said, I hold my views because I see myself as the son of the Father in heaven, the Holy One, blessed be He. And in His sacred Torah, He has given us this land. If they could, the Arabs would come, take you out of your house and kill you. They are fanatics, these Arabs, and I'm not an extremist. I can't stand them. I think that we Israelis are stupid in one thing, which is that we don't erase them. If you ask me, one has to do a Holocaust to them, not peace. One of the terrible consequences of violence is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and other psychological issues. All I have to say about this is that the incidence of PTSD, of moderate to severe PTSD, is much, much higher than it is in other countries in the world, especially in certain areas, like, for instance, in the Gaza Strip or in Sderot. There have been studies that have found that over 50% of children have moderate to severe symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are other consequences, like behavioral problems in children, attention deficit disorder, and depression that are much, much more prevalent. This is a problem because the prevalence of these disorders is so large that it stops being an individual problem, an individual mental health issue, and it becomes a social issue. It is something that feeds into the conflict, because the reactions of many of these people are actually